Hello all, Rick here, looking into a pivotal design era of Star Trek lore. When Star Trek Discovery first came onto our screens, many, including myself, were taken aback by the large change in how things looked, from the uniforms to the ship design and overhauled Klingons. This video is not looking into the overall redesigns, merely the starships, as I have done with the Picard-era Starfleet. In the years since, apocryphal lore has done what it always does, and attempts to smooth out the divergence with small drops here and there from various sources. But in doing the ship design series for a while now, I've noticed enough of these that I think it makes for an interesting video, so let's get on with it. Of course, the real reason for the design was a directive from producer Brian Fuller that the show have its own look and feel to distinguish the series. Certain aspects, like the flatter shapes and square nacelles, were there to make the ships different from the original series. TOS may be the closest to the original Discovery setting in canon, but like it or not, the show's set design is dated. Now, this overhaul did come with some anachronisms, which is for a different topic as there are quite a few. But again, many of these have since been downplayed or altered to be less jarring. But real-world discussions on this topic tend to devolve into it's a different universe or does it even matter? So I'm just gonna pick up that whole topic and put it over there. It's more fun to talk about the in-universe lore. With the formation of the United Federation of Planets in 2161, Starfleet was moved over to be managed by that joint organisation instead of just Earth. With it came the influx of many new technologies now being openly shared between member planets, like the Vulcan's advanced warp technology. Until this point, the NX-01 had been the blueprint for what a Starfleet ship should look like. So, in an era between this and the original series, it's not unbelievable that ships would follow on from this trend, sticking with what works. The original warp core was a maintained and sealed unit, which was attached to twin nacelles lined with circular warp coils. Both are major design elements that dictate a ship's layout. The NX class was overhauled at one point with the addition of a secondary engineering hull to make room for new propulsion systems, and while this extended its usefulness for a little more time, the NX class was ultimately overtaken by every other new innovation. So, many new systems and technologies were suddenly available that decades of development followed, with the early years merely being trying to get all this disparate tech to play nice. Out of this endeavour, Operation Next Step was born. Operation Next Step began in the late 22nd century, when the bureaucratic and logistical dust had settled from the unifying of the member worlds. The goal was to overhaul, standardise, and create a new Starfleet with ships that made use of all these new innovations, and much of the early phases of this operation were teams of engineers and scientists poring over simulations and schematics. Amid the myriad of findings was the designing of a new warp coil system. The Cochrane Archer core and the cells were the original go-to for Starfleets, as they abided by designs set out by Zephram Cochrane and refined by Henry Archer. But a new core iteration, termed the Eve's Bayer drive, as a reference, was created, which included the more boxy quadrilinear warp coils. Although it was noted that the initial round designs had greater potential and were more conservative. For now, however, the shift in design was adopted. According to technical books, one of the first products of Next Step was the Walker class, launched in 2195. This is the same class as the USS Shenzhou, and immediately from its design we can see the lineage of the NX class. Hailed as a frontier exploration vessel like the Enterprise NX-01 before it, the Walker class starships quickly became the poster for Starfleet. However, not everything aboard them was smooth sailing, with a myriad of quirks from its numerous inclusions. After all, we had 34 years between the formation of the UFP and Operation Next Step's first launch. During this time, Starfleet had been experimenting with its disparate fleet of Vulcan, Andorian and United Earth starships. A lot of these inspirations made it into the Walker, such as the unconventional position of the main bridge being on the underside of the ship, or transporter systems using horizontally aligned pads. These quirks were simply because you could spend countless decades refining and simulating designs, but ultimately you had to bite the bullet and just launch a ship and test what worked. While the Walker excelled beyond expectations, it revealed some shortcomings, and the second attempt was the Shepard class. It was basically bred from the same research as the Walker, but now refined and streamlined into a design element that would become synonymous with the Discovery era designs. The razor thinness, the square nacelles, and the hull texturing are now traits that would be present in the next 4 decades of vessels. Despite these clear connections in design, Starfleet did continue to experiment with other ideas, including bridge placement, level of armament, and positioning of them, and most notably, nacelle designs. Constantly trialling new warp profiles and workarounds, we got a ton of different ships of varying shapes, all related by the same design tree. One big problem for these ships, however, was the choice to use the square warp nacelles. The innovation, while providing greater speeds and power in the short term, was only really furtherable by adding more of them. This led to numerous experiments with additional nacelles being added, or simply longer nacelles to house more coils. This drastically increased the scale of Starfleet ships of that era, and the last vessel produced by Next Step was the Crossfield class, which has nacelles longer than its keel. So it becomes evident that eventually a different design would be required. In 2240, the fleet-wide adoption of the Duotronic computer system, as invented by Richard Daystrom, led to a change in user interface design among the fleet, and while many of these ships did receive overhauls, the consoles were still already inbuilt and unchanged. While newer vessels, like the planned Constitution, Hermes and Archer classes, were beneficiaries of these new systems from their inception, and were designed accordingly. In addition to this, it's not like Starfleet gave up on looking into developing other warp drive options, and continued success had been found in continuing the development of the Cochrane Archer engine. This system was continually being refined, and again around the 2240s, the more conservative warp coil system was on par with the current era's favoured squarer nacelles, but maintained the higher potential versatility. Much like the new computer systems, Starship lines that entered production from this era were more likely to receive the new engine designs, with the iconic Constitution class being assigned the best systems of the time. In one novel, from 2257, the Enterprise is explained as having had extensive overhauls since its appearance in the cage, but also that the simpler looking internals are the product of more advanced tech and automation at play. Continuity since then seems to contradict this, but the key takeaway is that newer ships were now following a different design philosophy. Most of the vessels we see in the opening of Star Trek Discovery are products of this era of development, all launched between the late 22nd century and the year 2235. The outlier is the USS Discovery herself, along with the Glenn and possibly other Crossfield classes. However, we have several mitigating factors for this, primarily that Operation Next Step had officially ended by this time, and the Crossfield was developed from its resurrected notes. Additionally, we only see 2 Crossfield classes in canon, and these are both the Spore Drive testbed vessels, which have had heavy modifications to house that experimental drive. It's not every Crossfield that could spin its saucer to generate the subspace field needed, for example. The only other time we see a Crossfield, it's not even an official ship and more of a hodgepodge of classes, but what elements remain suggest that the Disco and the Glenn were unique anyway. So, retroactive lore points out that despite how much they fit in with the other ships, Starfleet had already begun moving away from this style following the tech trends. Another reason for the change in fleet design was the Klingon War, which saw 1/3 of Starfleet ships destroyed, and most of these were older vessels. This happened for 2 reasons. Firstly, well, the older ships were simply more likely to fail against the Klingons' forces than the top-of-the-line new Starfleet cruisers. and the second reason was that a lot of the newer ships were kept away from the front lines of the war, like the Enterprise or science ships like the Archer, so they survived. Finally, there is the simple and exciting factoid that we simply have not seen them all. There are a multitude of starships in active service and new designs being manufactured every year that might only have even 1 or 2 ships of the line, alongside the numerous prototypes that must exist that were not completely decommissioned. There's always room for new designs, and I still love it when we get new glimpses at ships, like the USS Kelsey May. Look at that beak. Overall, I actually like many of these designs, but aside from the smaller elements here and there, they do seem like they trend much closer to the late 23rd century ships like the refit Constitution and Miranda classes than the original series. There's also the plot addition that changes in the timeline might account for the visual overhaul, at least in Strange New Worlds, which can be used as a lore justification for any changes. Or quite simply, that the revamped looks are purely aesthetic and that in-universe, the contradictions are non-existent. Honestly, either is fine with me at this point, because I just enjoy talking about the lore. Thanks for watching. Now, the only discrepancy left to explain is why the Constitution class seems to have undergone a major scale change in the intervening years, and this is because